I'm ready.
My son, Tom, is an artist in Wichita, and it was part of the Douglas Design District group that has been doing work up and down Douglas Street. And he has a piece on the Anchor and also on Watermark's bookstore. And he grew up seeing a lot of artwork all around him. And when he was a little guy, he used to think that if he saw a painting in Wichita or a big painting, he thought it was his dad's. Everything was something like that. It was kind of fun. In any case, when he turned 18, he asked me for a couple things. One, he wanted me to do him a painting, and the other, he asked me to write my stories. And since then, I started writing, and for him, I wrote my memoirs, which consisted of 2 volumes. This first volume and then the second volume. This is sort of the general audience route, and this is sort of the parental guidance option. And then I also, after that, I started a novel and have finished it, and I'm working on a second novel. So because of my son, there's been a lot of interest. I mean, it's kind of pushed me to newer interests, things that I've always done. I've always been a writer, but to actually consolidate it and to publish it, with something else. And then I also write poetry.
Yeah.
So in any case, my son Tom has helped me by kind of pushing the limits. And for his 18th birthday, he asked me to do a painting for him. And I started this, and he's like 25 now. So it's like around 6 or 7 years in the making.
Yeah.
And it's still not quite done, but it's nearly done. Along the bottom, there's going to be some white line anime go over from some comic books. And that'll pretty much do it, I think. I think we'll be done. There's a little bit left on that little stamp.
Yeah.
But this relates to the way my imagery has looked to people for a long time. It's changing now quite a bit, but there's quite a few images in the soup here, and everything but the kitchen sink. And it's kind of a world art approach. There's a lot of dualities, male, female. This was kind of quiet and kind of passive, kind of emotive. This one is very violent, aggressive. The background colors are generally neutral. There's generally a map. There's no map in this one, but there's generally a map in my work. There's insets and white line over. I guess you could say that the Batman element is an inset or insert in the same way with the Botticelli Venus figure. There was going to be a stamp, but I actually kind of have opted not to put this red line stamp in it, but instead I have this seal, this kind of a wax seal that I'm starting to put in my work. And there's a couple more in other paintings that we can look at. And there's also some white line over now that are from Picasso's Vallard series. You can kind of barely see the face here. You'd have to kind of get up and take a closer look at. There's a figure here, arm, leg.
Yeah.
There's another face here, another kind of a face here, male face here.
Yeah, and you've got some of that up in the corner too.
Yeah, and now those white line is actually from the Kujihara temples, and that's a little different. And the background is from the Kujihara temples. And these are 11th century Indian temples around a particular city. And they are just a wealth of sculptural resources, which I've drawn from in the past. Also, I've drawn from Burmese and Greco-Roman. And I'm kind of pushing myself away from these particular references and moving into newer imagery, as artists do. They either explore or exploit a particular idea and then change and move on. But there's a lot of art historical references here. Most of these you're pretty familiar with.
Yeah.
So it keeps it pretty obvious, and that way it relates to a lot of people. And then I float things. This little seal right here, which will kind of look like it's laying on top when I get done and wash it down. And then a dodecahedron or a shape that is kind of floating out in space. This kind of gives it a three-dimensionality. But this has pretty much the basic elements that are in all of my work. Some things don't work, and either paint them out or paint something over them. And when I develop a new motif, it becomes a new layer on top of something that isn't working. So it's kind of a little trick I do that I fill the image up, and then if there's a weak spot, like for instance, right here, I don't care for this transition between these two elements. So the white line over kind of helps carry that. I felt like this area needed a large element here, which I originally was going to put a big terracotta stamp, but then I didn't really kind of like that idea, and so I've added this instead. So I have ways of just continuing to fill up the space. My degrees are in printmaking, actually, both bachelor's and master's, and because of that, as printmakers, for those of you who are printmakers, you know this, but the materials that we use in printmaking, whether there's copper and intaglio or Bavarian limestone for lithography, they're expensive, and it costs a lot, and the paper's expensive that you use. So we tend to fill up every square inch of an image. So that kind of carries over from my printmaking studies, which was at WSU back in the 60s and 70s. So I continue to think about every square inch of a painting and making sure that every area of the painting works, that there's no unthought of area, and that it's necessary to work out the balance either in color and form or in subject to justify the space that's used.
Yeah, you don't have a lot of empty space. I mean, even your white areas, they're very detailed with the way you mix your color.
Yeah, I'd probably, like even at the bottom, try to figure out exactly where I want to put the signature. If there's sort of a dead space that doesn't say much, the signature could be in there, over in that left-hand corner. And I don't really think about that ahead of time. It's not something I know that I'm going to do. It just keeps happening over and over. So there's a certain designer aspect in my work and to what I do. There's a lot of questions about theme and content, which I'm not talking about right now. These are mostly formalist aspects, but it's hard for me to really decipher a painting and to interpret or translate it to somebody else. And my only defense on that is that it's coming from a different part of the brain when you're working than, and I don't even know which part. It's probably frontal right section, and the execution of the work is probably more concrete thinking in the back of the brain. And I can talk about those concrete elements. And I taught design at WSU for a number of years, so I can talk about line, form, value, color, space, texture, and shape, and I can talk about the principles of design. I think, what are they? Unity, variety, dominance, relief, rhythm, balance, and limitation. But to talk about the content is really difficult, because it's kind of a hidden intuitive aspect of my thinking, which separates artists who have a visual vocabulary from the rest of us who maybe have other areas of expertise. If you're a math major, for instance, or if you're a dancer, mathematics uses another symbolic language, which represents some of the same things that we deal with in art. And a dancer would translate these same themes in a different way and use a different part of the brain, perhaps. We can still talk about it. We can still use our verbal language to talk about it. But sometimes we reach a point in which there are things which cannot be described in words. They're ineffable. And when I get into my own work, I separate myself from the translation of what I'm doing intentionally and just do whatever makes me feel good and whatever feels right. And that's hard to explain. Usually about 10 years after, and this has been almost 7 years, but usually about 10 years after, I can look at something and I can see it immediately and say, oh, no wonder I did that. I was either upset or happy or mad or felt a lot of anxiety or a lot of repression or something, and it was coming out in my paintings, where at the time I don't see it, I don't feel it, it doesn't seem to be that obvious to me. And maybe to you may see things in here that are red flags or obvious symbols for things that I'm not even seeing for myself. When Bob Dylan was first interviewed during the 60s for his writing, he always took the, kind of went on the aggressive, and it kind of attacked his interviewers because he really didn't either. And later, Martin Scorsese directed a movie about him, and he admitted that he didn't know where his ideas were coming from. And he just recently, this last week, received a Nobel Prize in Literature.
Yeah.
So that's pretty amazing. And he's kind of rejected that. You know, he doesn't really talk about it. He doesn't list it on his website. You know.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing that's happening to him now that happened to him back in the 60s, is that he didn't really know where it was coming from. You know, most people assign genius to a personality trait, where going back a few hundred years, genius was something that we tapped into. It wasn't something that we owned. It was another sort of meta consciousness that we were able to channel or tap into. And in a way, I think Bob Dylan, for instance, did that. He channeled the anger of the 60s, and he didn't even know where this was coming from. And he wrote prolifically. I mean, even any of his given songs are huge. They're not one or two lyrics that are just repeated over and over and over. Every line is a different line throughout the entire songs. And many of them are just brief segments of much larger poems. So he was really a poet who was writing about the anger and the political unrest and the demonstrations that were going on against so many issues: feminism, civil rights, the war in Vietnam, nuclear proliferation. I mean, there's so many things that were happening, drugs. But today, I mean, I think that's all out of his system, and he doesn't have the same motivations. In fact, he's become a sculptor. So, you know, he's using a different language, which is a different language from two-dimensional visual arts. So I'm a little shy to talk about content, and I really don't know where to begin on that. And recently I was talking to a friend about it, and he said, don't try. That's not for you to do.
No.
That's maybe something that a critic or an art historian might eventually try to decipher.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that most of the work that I've done over the last 20 years especially has been commission work. And so I'm always thinking about the client. I'm always thinking about the person who's going to see the work. And I'm separating myself from that because I've recently decided not to take on any more commissions. So it's kind of like being in graduate school in a way. I'm going back to that place where I'm doing work just for myself. And so the work is changing from what it looks like right here to new images and new imagery, which again is, I don't know where it's coming from. You know, I'm attracted to certain other artists and I appropriate their work, and I look at other art historical references and appropriate that. I add a lot of my own self into it with generally, this one doesn't actually have that, but I generally add a contemporary element from my own personal life, which is a major addition to it, and somehow that gets kind of caught up into the mix, and you can't really separate them out. But I'll leave that to Ashley to interpret then.
Yeah. I think it is a fantastic piece. Honestly, I like the way everything like relates to each other, even though they're nowhere close in time or where they were. You've just got stuff all over the world and all over time.
I'll tell you, here's one thing it might be. I mean, I'm just trying to kind of rack my brain here, but you're probably familiar with Joseph Campbell, and he would study. How's the best way to describe his studies? Is he an anthropologist? He looks at mythologies, and he looks at the way cultures have repeated